From the turn of the century until World War II was unlike anywhere in history. According to Sapphic author Gertrude Stein, herself a controversial figure in numerous ways, once said of the city, "Paris was where the 20th century was, the place that suited those of us who were to create the 20th century art and literature." This was a special place for creatives and outsiders, and never before had there been such an oasis for Sapphic women to come together and seek collective, open community where they could create art together and express themselves freely, loving each other in all of the messy and intense ways that had long been held secret or restrained to romantic friendship. Queer people of all flavors, growing an organic new sense of understanding of identity on the coattails of the new sexology studies that shook the foundations of society, came together to share ideas and love, and of course, drama in the City of Lights. Neighborhoods like Montparnasse and Montmartre harbored lively artist and outsider communities due to low rents and a tendency for locals to support them, or at least look the other way. Cheap living, strong community, a flourishing cafe culture, and radical new art and political movements created a flashbang moment in history that gave birth to some of the first openly queer icons. For the first time, the closet door was wide open for everyone to step out, at least at night. Because nighttime in Paris was a fascinating world of rapid change, people shirked old, dusty societal mores and entertained themselves at various bars, clubs, cabarets, and theaters that catered to more colorful crowds in more ways than one. From shows and clubs focusing on the art and music of the Black community, to queer ballrooms like Magic City, to, of course, the famous lesbian bars like Le Monocle, all of these places operated around a robust world of an only somewhat secret Paris, teeming with lesbian salons and social groups. It's hard to imagine this world today when there are so few lesbian bars left in the world. Not just in Paris. Here in the US, there are only a tiny amount of them left, and many overall gay bars tend to be rather unwelcoming to Sapphic women, but some do persist, like this one, Chicago's own Dorothy Downstairs. Places like this encourage inclusion and community while hearkening back to the legacy of the lesbian bars of yesteryear that paved the way for today's gays. What was it like back in that world? Come learn with me. But first, a word from today's sponsor, Aura. The internet is truly an uncertain place, and online privacy is now more important than ever, especially with how many bad actors are floating around online with easy access to your data, which is easily purchased from any number of data brokers. In a matter of minutes, anyone can find your email, phone number, full name, relatives, and home address by just paying a small fee. They can then sell that info on the dark web or use it to target you. It's so unnerving, which is why I started using Aura, which is an all-in-one system that protects my information and removes my data from various data broker sites automatically. Since I got my own info taken care of, I tried searching for info on one of my friends to see what comes up, and unsurprisingly, it was super easy to find their info. They were absolutely shocked and felt so unsafe, and as soon as I got them set up on Aura, the search results began to filter away. It's especially scary because recently AT&T customer data was leaked to the dark web, and of course they advised customers to change and protect passwords. But I have Aura to take care of all of that and more for me. Between password protection, security scans, spam reduction, credit checks, and credit locking, and more, I can rely on Aura to keep my info safe without the hassle of downloading a bunch of separate apps. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Kazro to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the Lesbos of Paris. I say this in a lot of my queer history videos, but it's a core thing that we need to establish. It is hard as fuck to qualify and quantify historical queer experiences because all structures of gender and sexuality are inherently tied to whatever the norm of the era is. And that norm structure is constantly in flux and entirely reliant on a myriad of factors. the era's politics, both past and present, the local and national cultures, the current issues and ongoing disasters and wars, the economy. Everything has a role in how society builds its gender and sexual parameters. So how we define gender today isn't the same as even 10 years ago, much less 50 or 100 years ago. And forms of queerness as a result are also not static or inherent. How we describe our queer identities are always a response and reaction to the norm, and how people may not fit inside of it. This is why it's impossible to assume one-for-one modern experiences and frameworks of gay and trans life in historical periods. They didn't have our framework, they had their own. Jack Halberstam very correctly points out in Female Masculinity, it has proven quite difficult to theorize sexuality and gender deviance in historical ways, and often the field is divided between untheoretical historical surveys and ahistorical models. Debates about the history of sexuality and the history of gender deviance have also very often reproduced this split, rendering historical sexual forms as either universal or completely bound by their historical moment. The challenge for new queer history has been and remains to produce methodologies sensitive to historical change, but influenced by current theoretical preoccupations. So some people obviously and incorrectly look at this and say, oh, well, because our modern structures and language weren't a thing back then, we can't use modern terms to describe historical people, and you can't call people trans or lesbian or bi and yada yada. Like, no, that's not really it either, I think. I'm gonna tap the sign again. There are two types of queer history: the queer history that was queer in its historical context, and the queer history that is reflective of ours. Both are valid, both are necessary. So let's just move past that and not argue about it. I'm going to be using the word lesbian as an overarching umbrella term for a lot of things in this video, and that has nothing to do with the, I guess, modern interpretation of the word lesbian, but more to do of how it was used in the era we're talking about. Okay, let's not start discourse in the comments. It's Pride Month. There's plenty of other discourse to be had over on Twitter. Go there instead. So in the era we're focusing on, the early 1900s, and especially the 20s and 30s, things are changing like crazy in the queer world like never before. For one thing, sexology as an official practice and study was firmly established, but still new in the grand scheme of things. People weren't used to having identity terms that describe sexuality as who you are rather than just an action, a verb. One result of this is the rise of the invert, or the Uranian, a unique theoretical identity which is now defunct but connected same-sex attraction to being trans in some way, using a lot of language that those of us who grew up in the 2000s are definitely familiar with. According to people like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who coined the term, sexual inverts are either men with the soul of a woman trapped in his body, or a woman with a man's soul trapped in hers. This disconnect of the soul's gender causes these people to experience not only homosexual attraction, that is, their attraction is inverted, but they also may display tendencies to act or dress more aligned with their inverted spirit. Masculine women, feminine men, who is the rooster, who is the hen? Obviously, a lot of gay people who experienced some sort of gender deviation, which is really common with lesbians like butches, or really effeminate gay men, or people who identified as trans, or sometimes fairies, which was often its own gender altogether, really identified with being an invert. It gave people a logical, scientifically rooted explanation for why they felt and desired what they did, and having solid labels for common queer experiences brought people together under a shared community and struggle. For the first time, a united queer community, though still very fragmented and divided by class, nationality, gender, and race lines, began to form with its own distinct language that people could both use to self-actualize and to begin thinking about social liberation. I mean, obviously early sexology had inherent issues, though. Positives aside, it still sought to define queerness by pathologizing it, attempting to explain people's experiences by framing them as a condition or a defect. Even though many sexologists were obviously allies to the queer community and attempted to use their studies to advocate for acceptance, It was flawed from day one in assuming that, quote, normal people would have sympathy for inverts and other queer folks just because it was something they couldn't help. Like, come on, man. Look at how people in these eras already treated disabled or non-white people. That should have probably already been a clue. And even with all these studies and theories flying around, many of which were greatly influenced by the interests of various governments at the time, female inverts seemed to be rather a mystery. For one thing, lesbian history itself is even more difficult to trace than that of gay men, because a lot of the time, sex between cis women was not seen as real sex because it doesn't involve PIV. So it wasn't criminalized, unless something was involved to emulate PIV. Then a woman is seeking to imitate and take the role of a man, and now it's a prosecutable no-no. So because in the minds of a lot of men, lesbians basically weren't real, a lot of the time they kind of flew under the radar and weren't really represented in sexological studies. Heike Bauer writes in Theorizing Female Inversion, Sexology, Discipline, and Gender in the Fin de Siècle. In his English translation of Psychopathia Sexualis, Francis J. Rebman's only reference to Krafft-Ebing's ideas on female same-sex sexuality and the law is a single sentence that states, "The chief reason why inverted sexuality in women is still covered in the veil of mystery is that the homosexual act, so far as women is concerned, does not fall under the law." To make things even more complex, many women were randomly called inverts when they weren't even gay, but simply because they were perceived as masculine during the rise of the New Woman, a type of female archetype in the turn of the century that covered feminists who championed women's rights and often partook in masculine-coded activities such as wearing mannish clothes, smoking, doing sports, or even going to school and reading books. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, we don't need to generalize all Victorians and Edwardians as people who thought this shit, but the ideas were there. To learn more about the mannish woman thing, I highly recommend Nicole Rudolph's video on the subject, or you can watch my video on Victorian women in sports. But yeah, the New Women, as they were called, were often pathologized as inverts to try and explain their aberrant behavior. And the New Woman sometimes did identify with this, completely ignoring same-sex desire as a factor. They and others sometimes viewed these unwomanly actions or modes of dress as an effective unsexing of themselves, as a removal or alteration of their womanhood. See what I mean about sexuality and gender frameworks as forever shifting? Back then, wearing trousers and smoking a pipe could make your ass trans, but it wouldn't today. Things are always in flux. But hilariously, because things are always in flux, we are now swinging back around to goofy shit that would have seemed real familiar to the Victorians, brought to you most kindly by the very creative and usually incorrect transvestigators. You know, those transphobic people who are always like, we can always tell if you're trans. And then they start like saying Taylor Swift was born male because she has like a normal person's trapezius or a 10-degree angled jaw or whatever the fuck. Just real unhinged loser shit.
Care about your testosterone? Never touch receipts. Receipts have 10 times more estrogen materials than birth control. If you want to be high test, never touch receipts, or else you're gonna be a woman.
Time is a flat circle. Anyway, because of women's unique and often obscured relationship with sexology and emerging queer studies, new insulated and culturally unique lesbian communities were on the rise in large metropolitan zones, and as they flourished, lesbians began finding ways to find each other. One obvious way is, of course, flagging. And there's no better way to flag and make a statement than through unique fashion. For centuries, Sapphic fashion has inherently subverted the various social rules for women's fashion. Of course, one calls to mind obvious examples like Anne Lister or the ladies of Llangollen, who adopted various aspects of menswear into their dress. Skirts paired with mannish cuts of coats and neckwear, carrying walking sticks and wearing men's hats. I don't have time today to get fully into the debacle about bloomers, but that was a significant turning point in the politics surrounding women's fashion and women in pants. Well into the 20th century, it was illegal in many places for women to wear pants or in any significant way to cross-dress. In places like Los Angeles, there were actually laws stating that a woman must wear a minimum number of female garments or she would be arrested. But women's styles, especially after the First World War, persisted in becoming more and more gender neutral, or even masculine in many ways, at least compared to its Victorian and Edwardian predecessors. So, to add intensity to flagging and radical dress, many lesbians took trends a step further and developed unique fashion statements special to women loving women. As Diana Suhami writes in No Modernism Without Lesbians, high collars and monocles, though not de rigueur, were clues. So was brilliantine short hair, a white carnation or sprig of violets pinned to a jacket lapel, a ring on a pinky finger. Beyond such badges of allegiance, an appraising glance of recognition was universally understood. It's these little things you can see in famous photos of lesbian nightlife in the era, in addition to iconic trends shared between lesbians and gay men. The iconography of the sailor and the bellhop, the over-the-top posh gentleman. This thing never stays in. Ugh, I don't know how they did it. Of course, this means there was and still is a ton of overlap between the historical experiences of the Sapphic people who donned menswear in various ways and the experiences of people who today identify as lesbians, non-binary, trans men, simply cross-dressers, and more. It's crucial to understand that these experiences and feelings mirror each other in a huge way. All of these people shared the same community, the same spaces, and found comfort in their similarities rather necessarily than their differences, with exceptions, as we'll get into. And the differences are important too, make no mistake. Although it's difficult to make a one-to-one assessment of historical identities to match the ones we know and use today, we can still use certain labels where they fit because of the specific ways people went about their lives, even if they don't have the same terms. For example, one person whose experience with dress was directly affected by the politics of lesbian fashion was a person named Colonel Victor Barker, who was born Valerie Arkell Smith. He lived life fully as a man for years, even marrying a woman, and when Barker's sex was discovered and word went public, his wife claimed she had no idea until she read about it in the newspaper, which was definitely not true. And ironically, an intense amount of vitriol towards Barker came from Radcliffe Hall, a figure we'll discuss in a minute. She wrote to her literary agent, "I would like to see her drawn and quartered, a mad pervert of the most undesirable type." The irony in this comes from the fact that Hall herself had just finished going through the obscenity trial against her banned lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, and Hall was famously masculine and struggled with her gender. It's so funny looking at history and seeing where these bizarre lines got drawn for people. It's important to note, though, that the decade following World War I was a really bizarre and fluid one for gender and fashion. More intensely than ever, fashion didn't really mean a whole lot in connection to one's gender or sexuality. In the last several decades to the modern day, less so as years go on, but still present, there is an assumption that your dress signals something about your identity and behavior. Women who dress masculine must be lesbians, or at least bisexual. Maybe the people dressing this way are trans or non-binary. Men who dress in basically anything that shows any color or personality are obviously gay. This was simply not the case in the mid-10s to 20s. Laura Doan writes, "The magazine Eve depicts a virtual panorama of what might be called the passing fashions of the 1920s, active women moving into the once exclusively masculine preserve of motorboat racing and yachting, rakishly boyish society women, a cross-dressed artist, and an actor posing as a tomboy. The clothing obscures rather than reveals gender and sexuality, so that we might well wonder what each passed for in the 20s. A woman passing as or taken to be a boy or a man? A heterosexual woman passing as a lesbian passing as heterosexual? A woman of any sexual preference dressing boyishly or mannishly to pass as a woman of fashion? A lesbian passing as a lesbian?" It's such a strange moment in time, so different from the generations prior when dress meant everything to identity. And dressing mannishly or acting mannish was effectively enough to unsex a woman or even make her basically a man, whether figuratively or literally. When you look at the odd medical claims of the Victorian era, it really paints a bizarre picture of an alternate reality of transness. The 20s trends in particular became so inspired by gender play that it almost created a veil that protected lesbians because so many women were doing it. By 1927, an entire label was coined for women who pushed these boundaries, the boyette. and boy did it make the culture critics freak the fuck out. The Daily Mail reported, "The boyette not only crops her hair close like a boy, but she dresses in every way as a boy. In age, she appears to be in the last years of flapperdom, and her ambition is to look as much like a boy as possible, but little feminine mannerisms disclose her sex and show her amusing herself by masquerade that is harmless enough, though some people may disapprove of it as ultra-tomboyish. What they think does not trouble the boyette. She revels in the freedom of movement. A point of interest to eugenists is that the boyette has a finer physique than the average boy of her age." Yeah, let's bring eugenics into this. Yeah, of course. Why the hell did I think they wouldn't? Hilariously, some writers went to the extent of claiming that women were dressing more boyish in order to, quote, compete with the pansies, because men are becoming so much more gay, so now if a woman wants a man, she needs to become a man, which accidentally turns her into a lesbian. Oh! So as a result, it's really hard to make hard and fast declarations about a lot of the trends that lesbians used, because a lot of the time, they were following the same posh trends that straight women were. Even the monocle, so iconic in its place in lesbian fashion history that one of the most famous lesbian bars was named after it, was more of a trend of women trying to emulate sleek bourgeois masculinity than lesbians necessarily inventing it as a unique flagging trend. Women in cropped hair, called the Eton crop, wasn't really a marker of lesbianism back then the way that it became in the 80s and 90s. It was the major style moving into the 20s. When newspapers reported on these women sporting these fashions, they didn't question their sexuality, they called them ultra-modern. So, in a lot of cases, using our modern eyes to look at women of the 20s and 30s and looking for lesbian style is often a losing game. The markers were so much more subtle, more of a devil in the details. As Laura Doan continues, if in the 1920s boyishness as fashion meant passing neither as a boy nor as a lesbian, then we need to be careful in reading masculine as synonymous with lesbian. For this reason, we must be cautious when biographers such as Ormrod assert that Lady Una Truebridge's mode of self-presentation certainly leaves the viewer in little doubt as to her proclivities. The whole point of 20s fashion was that no one knew for sure. The same is hard to say for the 30s, however, because in the 1930s, the boyish fashions of the 20s skewed more feminine once again, and in the cultural atmosphere, it became more common for people to associate sexual identity with a person's clothing, and so the line in the sand was more solid than before. For the first time in many years, probably since before the First World War, women became anxious about being perceived as mannish, because it was once again tied to sexual deviance, in no small part due to the obscenity trial surrounding Radcliffe Hall's book, The Well of Loneliness. So, women still choosing to dress masculine now prompted the thought, is she a lesbian? In 1935, Olga Knopf wrote, "In certain circles, a custom has arisen of wearing what might almost be called a homosexual uniform, a severely masculine suit with men's shirts or mannish blouses to match. It was not originally a fashion confined to homosexuals, but nowadays, if one sees a young woman who was previously dressed like everybody else suddenly take to this uniform, one will hardly go wrong if one guesses that she has become a homosexual and is advertising the change." I mean, I get it. That's kind of what I was trying to do when I got all my hair chopped off for the first time in early high school, and I definitely think it did succeed in advertising me as a lesbian. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that many of the most famous Saphics in Paris did adopt these radically ungendered styles. And of course, they were usually also the artists. Truman Capote, the author of many classics such as In Cold Blood, once said of Romaine Brooks that her body of work was the all-time ultimate gallery of famous dykes, and that could not be more true. Brooks was a painter and ran closely in lesbian circles, along with another lesbian painter who simply went by the name Gluck. Gluck in particular was so androgynous that many newspapers often reported her as maybe a boy or a girl, and the essayist and photographer E.O. Hoppe wrote, "To look at the face of Gluck is to understand both her success as an artist and the fact that she dresses as a man. Originality, determination, strength of character, and artistic insight are expressed in every line. Gluck's facial contour indicates the qualities expressed in her paintings, combining force and decision with the sensitiveness of the visionary. The art that these two made, along with the surrealist works of lesbians like Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, that I'll get into in a minute, were vital in not only expressing the feelings and imagery of lesbianism in the interwar years, but helped to define it too, in particular by spotlighting iconic lesbian figures in portraiture, in all of their fashionable glory. One very significant person that Romain Brooks painted was the iconic Lady Una Troubridge, who was an English aristocrat and self-proclaimed invert, who donned and also often trailblazed some of the most popular lesbian styles of the era. With her avant-garde fuck-ass bob, monocle, menswear-inspired clothing, and aloof demeanor, she quickly became a staple in the lesbian world of Paris, although she and Radcliffe Hall didn't really spend a lot of time there, bridging the gap between British and French lesbian cultures. She was also the life partner of Radcliffe Hall, the infamous author of the lesbian novel The Well of Loneliness, and haver of weird and ironic opinions on trans men, I guess. So you may have noticed that I'm using she, her pronouns for Radcliffe Hall, unlike Claude Cahun, who I use they, them pronouns for later in this video. You very well could use they, them pronouns for Radcliffe Hall, who did in fact struggle with her gender and often went by John Hall. This is a point of extreme contention for a lot of historians and queer historians in general. It is impossible to say if Radcliffe Hall would have identified as a trans man today. Given her reactions to trans men in her own time, that's why I hesitate to place that identity upon her. But I would say if you want to lean into that interpretation of her preferences and her gender, you wouldn't be necessarily wrong either. It's just one of those situations that makes interpreting queer history so difficult. With Radcliffe Hall specifically, it's just so complicated. But as for Claude Cahun, in the 1920s to 30s, Claude Cahun literally wrote out their desire for neutrality in language, their desire to be seen as gender neutral, or in many ways gender fluid. And so for that reason, I do use they, them pronouns for them, but also when it comes to Claude Cahun, I don't think you would be wrong to use she, her pronouns, because they did use those pronouns at that time. So it's just a really complex issue. Please be polite to each other in the comments. As W.R. Gordon wrote of The Well of Loneliness in the Daily News and Westminster Gazette in 1928, the chief objection to the sort of relationship which Miss Radcliffe Hall attempts to justify is that it poisons all those other innocent, cheerful, affectionate relationships and leaves no part of life secure from the wandering dragon of lust. Oi. Now, The Well of Loneliness is a really interesting book and one of my favorites. It's very clearly intended to be a veiled autobiography of Hall's life and complicated experience with gender. She grew up feeling always more masculine, more aligned with boyhood, divorced from traditional femininity, in no small part due to her attraction to women and unorthodox upbringing. There's lots of angles we can interpret this from. For one thing, the feeling of being removed from womanhood due to a lack of attraction to men is a very common lesbian experience, and one that I understand personally. That's why a lot of lesbians identify with lesbianism as a gender. Living in a world completely structured around men, which society is, where so much of womanhood and femininity is traditionally built around its relationship to men, to the attraction to men, of course, many lesbians feel inherently othered. The classic and most vital writing on this feeling is obviously Monique Wittig's 1981 essay, One is Not Born a Woman. She writes, "Not only is there no natural group women, we lesbians are living proof of it, but as individuals as well we question woman, which for us, as Simone de Beauvoir, is only a myth. She said, one is not born, but becomes a woman." The whole essay is a very key piece of feminist theoretical history, and worth a read, of course. It manages to draw connections to a wide breadth of unique experiences that lesbians have, as well as other Saphics in their own unique ways. Everyone is connected, yay, yippee! But obviously the other experience that comes to mind when reading Radcliffe Hall's work and life story is the parallels to what could easily be described today as an experience a trans-masc person would identify with. Heike Bauer continues, Hall's protagonist, Stephen Gordon, who is herself well-versed in the writings of Ulrichs and Krafft-Ebing, certainly provides the most recognizable self-identified female invert in English literary history, and the novel's subsequent appearance in early 20th century sexology clearly indicates some of the complex interactions between sexological and literary spheres. Obviously, it's impossible to say if Hall would have identified as trans today, especially given their weirdo opinions, but that's really not the point. The same experiences are there that many people from many avenues of queerness can relate to, which I think is really cool. The thing is, though, Radcliffe Hall sort of became the genesis of our modern idea of lesbianism. After the obscenity trial surrounding The Well of Loneliness in 1928, which resulted in a huge media scandal that suddenly publicized to the world what a lesbian looks like. Of course, Radcliffe Hall was that image. A mannish woman who dresses in a rather ungendered way. Suddenly, people had a good idea of what a female sexual invert looks like, and it furthered the process of the already slowly coagulating modern idea of homosexuality. In his book, The Wild Century, Alan Sinfield calls this, quote, the moment of indeterminacy. For it is not that our idea of the homosexual was hiding beneath other phrases, or lurking unspecified in the silence, like a statue under a sheet, fully formed but waiting to be unveiled. It was in the process of becoming constituted. I think a lot of people will look at this and maybe become annoyed or even more confused or maybe even frustrated. Some people might feel like this sort of invalidates modern queer labels or something, but I really don't think so. It also means that our modern labels of queerness aren't actually more or less valid than historical ones. Like, a way that a lot of people talk about history is like, they didn't have the language for this yet. And it's like, well, yes, they didn't have our language yet, but they had theirs. And in their context, that's just as valid. Like, I really want to discourage people coming at history from a modern standpoint from instinctively regarding historical people as like stupid or ignorant to their own identities, because identity is not a fixed thing throughout all of human history. It's not inherent necessarily. It revolves around how our society is built. That's why every single different society has their own forms of queerness, because it relates to what their society builds up as gender and sexuality. Does that make sense? Because isn't it almost just like a little bit exciting, though? Because we're always in a moment of indeterminacy in many ways. Queerness is always in flux, even as we speak. We are currently in a moment of shifting into another model of meaning, and always will be. There were a vast number of interwar lesbians in particular who recognized the issue that Monique Wittig went on to write about, and they manifested their outsider experiences of gender in their own special ways. One of my favorites of these lesbians in Paris was, of course, Claude Cahun. I would obviously be remiss not to bring up Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, given that I have literally written and illustrated a graphic novel biography on them. Liberated, the radical art and life of Claude Cahun. You can purchase it from the link in the description below, and I highly encourage you to do so. I'm very proud of it. But anyway, Cahun and Moore were easily two of the most important lesbian surrealist artists in Paris, and much like Radcliffe Hall, Cahun had a very distinct struggle with their gender as well. Born Lucy Schwab in Nantes, they were the child of a well-known Jewish newspaper owner. Lucy grew up surrounded by literature and history and art, and in their youth they met and fell in love with Suzanne Malherbe. The two became inseparable and remained together until death. They also became an artistic power duo, adopting the pseudonyms Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore and collaborating on these absolutely incredible surrealist photos and writings. They also notably kept extremely detailed journals and memoirs, so we are very lucky to have a lot of information about their lives and feelings. They spent a lot of time in the lesbian world of Paris, as well as radical political groups fighting for social justice and freedom. They eventually moved to the island of Jersey, which later became occupied by the Nazis during World War II, and they used their artistic skills and experience writing political manifestos to secretly resist and fight the Nazi occupiers by creating anonymous tracts and other pieces of protest art from the perspective of a fictional disgruntled German soldier that they called the Soldier with No Name. When they were eventually caught and imprisoned and sentenced to death, The Nazis firmly believed that their work must have been the work of a massive underground resistance, that there was no way these two simple old ladies could do all of that. It's a testament to how powerful their resistance was, how many German soldiers must have seen their work and decided to lay down their guns and desert. And we do know some of them did, based on how many friends these two made in prison who were former German soldiers. Thankfully, Cahen and Moore survived, and their legacy lives on in their stunning work. I was so happy that when I visited Paris, I got to see the street named in their honor, as well as the apartment that they lived in during their exciting years here in interwar Paris. To learn more about these icons, definitely buy my graphic novel and give it a read. And I would also encourage you to check out the works listed in the sources below by Tirza True Latimer, Jennifer Shaw, and Jeffrey Jackson. Tirza especially very personally helped me when I was writing my graphic novel, and her books on queer women in Parisian history are so incredible. Now, one place that served as a beautiful center of queer life in Paris that wasn't a club, and that Cahen and Moore visited practically all the time, was the bookstore owned by the Sapphic couple Sylvia Beach and her partner Adrienne Monnier, the original Shakespeare & Company. Now, obviously there still is one by the Seine near Notre Dame. Odds are you've seen people walking around with like this tote bag. Obviously, I had to get one myself when I visited, but the Shakespeare & Company that exists in Paris today isn't the original. It's the successor, named in honor of Sylvia Beach's original. The first Shakespeare & Company was the breeding ground for a massive number of creatives, including Ernest Hemingway and friend of the channel, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Of course, another author that stopped by Sylvia and Adrienne's Shakespeare & Company was the famous writer and bohemian Sapphic, Colette, the author of stories like Cherie and Gigi. In fact, any queer writer at one point or another ended up there. Sylvia and Adrienne often sold pirated copies of banned books, like The Well of Loneliness, or even published them, like Ulysses by James Joyce. Quite literally, an American in Paris, Sylvia had come to Paris to study literature, and one rainy day stumbled into the little gray bookshop owned by Adrienne Monnier. The two sat there for hours talking, and Sylvia wrote, "That was the beginning of much laughter and love, and a lifetime together." Together in the late 1910s, they opened Shakespeare & Company, which was also a lending library, and they moved in together on Rue de l'Odéon. The bookshop lasted strongly until it was shut down by the Nazis during the occupation in World War II.
And then I decided to have a bookshop of my own, and it was my French friend who encouraged me to, and my French friend. And they all said, "Oh yes, have this bookshop and we'll all come to it."
As I said earlier, more often than not, queer historical figures have to be identified and interpreted by their actions rather than a flat-out statement like we may have with people today. They very rarely have quotes in writing that are like, "Oh yeah, I am only attracted to women as a woman," or something like that, and part of that is because having identity labels is a rather new phenomenon. For most of history, sex and how you went about it and who you desired wasn't who you are, it was a thing you did, an action. The changes of the turn of the century made this a vastly different framework, and for the first time, you got people defining themselves in terms that describe their queerness. Natalie Barney is one of the few obviously queer figures of this era who we have actual recorded quotes from of her openly declaring her identity. She once wrote, "I am a lesbian. One need not hide of it or boast of it, though being other than normal is a perilous advantage." So right off the bat, Natalie Barney is an extremely unique figure. Like many of these other open and prominent lesbian figures, except for Sylvia Beach and Adrienne, Natalie was able to live her life open and freely because she inherited a huge fortune from her father. Without having to struggle for money, she didn't need to marry, although she was engaged to a very understanding guy for a while. Natalie came to terms with her lesbianism from a very young age, and at 18 she met her first long-term partner, Ava Palmer. Together, the two women dreamed of recreating the lesbian utopia that Sappho's work evokes. They believed they could create it in Paris, a place where creative Sapphic women could come together and freely love one another. Against her father's wishes, Natalie published Quelques portraits sonnets de femmes, a collection of love poems about her female lovers. Truthfully, she was kind of a rizzler and had a lot of various flings. Today, she would have probably identified as polyamorous. Ava was cool with this, and it seems that they both were poly and enjoyed having an open relationship. Alas, in 1907, Ava left Natalie to marry a man, and they ran off to Greece to basically LARP living ancient Greek life in Delphi. But she wasn't super attracted to him, and he eventually had an affair with his cousin. Huge good luck babe moment for Natalie, I'm sure. At her beautiful apartment at 20 Rue Jacob, Natalie took to continuing that dream of bringing Lesbos to Paris. Here, she hosted regular salons where creatives of all sorts gathered. Mostly Sapphic women, but men did join in and knew their place as the side characters.
My idea was that the French and the Americans and the English should meet and translate each other's works as much as possible. And so I opened it in that view. Then it became a well-known thing. People came, flocked here. They were sitting in chairs and they were initiated into each other's art.
Natalie's next long-term relationship was with Lily de Gramont, the Duchess of Clermont-Tonnerre. Ava was with Natalie for 10 years. And Lily for 45 until her death. Lily left her husband, children, and fortune for Natalie, partially against her will, and the two drew up a symbolic marriage contract to bind them. Beyond her love affairs, Natalie managed to do what was previously thought impossible. She successfully united a massive, previously isolated lesbian community, and through that community, many, many more women were able to explore and realize their attractions to women where they otherwise may not have. Physical community is so important to marginalized groups. To have a safe, real place that they could go and gather was a wonder that people had hardly dreamed of before. And there it was, in an apartment in Paris. But Natalie Barney's salon wasn't even close to the only places that lesbians gathered. After all, it was indeed for the most special, most creative people, and you kinda had to be invited through knowing a guy. Most other Saphists weren't there, but they did certainly have other places they could go. Obviously, outside of salons and cafes and bookstores, all of these people and more came together under the protective cloak of night to convene at any number of lively lesbian bars, cabarets, and clubs. As would be the case for the next several decades, and even for some today, many of these patrons of the gay nightlife were in their own ways going undercover, closeted in their daily lives, and went to gay establishments by night to engage with their more authentic selves. It was a good opportunity to wear any clothes you wanted, to be as camp or toned down as you pleased. These were truly liminal spaces where all forms of questioning and confusion were valid and even encouraged. As Diana Suhami continues, what is correct attire and true appearance? Who is the real person, unmasked, as opposed to the presented self? Paris allowed candor and was where pretense could be stripped, expectations confounded, identity fluid, and sexual relationships open. The autobus was a vehicle for transparency, free expression, and the breaking of rules. When I stayed in Paris researching for this video, I stayed in Montparnasse, not only because it's where Claude Guérin, Marcel Moore, and Natalie Barney lived, but because them being there was for a very pointed reason. If Montmartre was where the lesbians and their queer folks explored the more dirty angles of sexuality and partied, Montparnasse was more often the quieter, more domestic Sapphic center. Shakespeare and Company was here, and so too were a number of bars that catered directly to Saphists. The most famous is, of course, Le Monocle. Located on Boulevard Edgar Quinet, you would never look at this dark, unoccupied storefront today and imagine that it was once a place of such significance. With its unique circular entrance, Le Monocle was one of the very first lesbian clubs in Paris. It opened in the 20s by Lucienne Franchi, or Lulu de Montparnasse, a rather iconic character who went on to also run the La Roulotte Cabaret. Le Monocle openly allowed women to dress in menswear, kiss, and dance together, and had an all-woman band. Of all the lesbian clubs in Paris, Le Monocle is so famous because it was thankfully immortalized by the photographer Brassailles. In 1932, he was permitted entry to the club to take some photos, as he did with many queer venues of the 30s like Magic City. He focused largely on photographing the secret Paris, the shadowy and hidden parts of the city unknown to those who don't go searching for it. sex workers, trans people, and drag performers, clubs spotlighting people of color, and of course, lesbians. It's extremely fortunate that we have these photos, a remarkably intimate look into a world now lost to time. Le Monaco employed a number of trainers, but one of the most significant was a butch woman named Fred. Born Suzanne Jean Bolet in 1914, Fred took on her famous new name when she joined the Le Monaco staff. It was there that she caught the eye of famous actress Marlene Dietrich in 1936, and their relationship lasted for almost a decade, with a close friendship between the two persisting well into the 70s. It was under Marlene's support that Fred set her sights on bigger dreams. She left her job at Le Monaco and opened La Silhouette, or Chez Fred as it was known, a lesbian cabaret on the Quartier Pigalle at the base of Montmartre. Of course, being the lover of Marlene Dietrich, Chez Fred became a hotspot for various big names, and Fred and her unique style was a major drawing point. Errol Flynn, one of the most famous actors to play Robin Hood, once wrote, "She dressed better than any man I had ever seen. Her overall effect was that of a sophisticated English schoolboy. Her man's haircut looked better on her than on any man." Whatever style a man does, a butch will always do it better. That's just the facts. During the Nazi occupation of Paris, Fred went into hiding, but returned after liberation and was hired at Le Carrel's, a famous cabaret that attracted even bigger names. During her time at Carrel's, Fred made radical moves such as allowing women to dance together, which was against the law, and her influence skewed Carrel's in a distinctly lesbian direction. She would remain a significant icon of Parisian lesbian life until her death from leukemia in the 70s. But of course, Fred's cabarets were not the only lesbian places in Montmartre and Pigalle. Even today, anyone who enters Pigalle right off the train gets a rather instantaneous idea that it is the sexual center of Paris. The street is covered block to block with strip clubs, adult theaters, sex shops, and naughty bars. Back in Fred's heyday, this space wasn't that much different. The famous Moulin Rouge itself is just a short walk up the street. It was a hot spot for people looking to have a raucous, spicy good time, and it was of course welcoming to patrons and businesses that fell well outside the bounds of normal sexual and gender expression. In the 30s alone, more than 20 Sapphic cabarets opened in Paris, and many others became Sapphic naturally over time via the typical gay invasion method. One other significant figure of lesbian Montmartre that predated Fred was Palmyre, who operated an 1890s lesbian brasserie called Le Souris across the street from the Moulin Rouge. Palmyre's professional portfolio of lesbian business ventures is extremely well documented due to how frequently she appears in police and court records. Her persistence, among others, is rather heroic when you think about it. By continuing to drive forward despite legal threats and pushback to build out these spaces of Montmartre that welcomed the gay community, who were shunned everywhere else, both created a record in history of queer life and existence, and allowed persecuted people to live lives as their authentic selves and enjoy themselves, even if only during the nightly opening hours. And these clubs also had a vital role in starting or popularizing key aspects of many queer dynamics that we still have today. For example, these cabarets typically employed what was called an entraîneuse, or a woman on staff who would dress in menswear and usually flirt or otherwise politely entertain the lady patrons, or the frocked up ones. This was one of the early forms of the butch femme subculture and dynamic. World War II did a number on everywhere, but Paris was literally occupied by the Nazis, and that obviously changed everything. The Germans burned a huge amount of queer studies and literature, and known places that catered to the queer community were shut down. But like in the US, when the war was over and everybody had to pick up the pieces again, society boomeranged around to trying to cope by reverting to conservative, traditional values that discouraged any way of life that broke from the norm. Anything different was considered a potential threat, and while the Red Scare in Europe wasn't exactly the same as it was in the US, it was still risky to be associated with queerness, which often got you looped in with accusations of communism. So, with their meeting places gone, many of the old lesbian matriarchs, dead or too tired to come out of hiding, simply desiring peace and quiet, the raucous lesbian nightlife became sparse. Certain figures like Fred and the new owners of Le Monaco tried and failed to bring their establishments back, but they didn't last that long. Le Monaco shuttered, the cabarets ceased being lesbian specific, and time marched on. Of course, people found new ways to continue meeting and having community, but that glimmering, fascinating moment in history was firmly over. Today, there aren't that many lesbian bars left around the world at all, for many reasons depending on the country. But still, the spirit of Sapphic lives past lives on in many ways, and for me it calls to mind the words of Virginia Woolf, a woman that I dislike on a personal level, but I will credit her with significance in her role as a prominent lover of women. In a letter to her lover, Vita Sackville-West, both of them frequenters of Natalie Barney's salons, she strung together words that I hear echoed in the flowery, wistful messages, dating app bios, poetry, and even TikToks that lesbians post today. Throw over your man, and we'll go to Hampton Court and dine on the river together, and walk in the garden in the moonlight, and come home late, and have a bottle of wine and get tipsy, and I'll tell you all of the things that I have in my head. They won't stir by day, only by dark on the river. Think of that. Throw over your man, I say, and come. Thank you for learning with me about Paris in the interwar years and its secret lesbian world. I really hope you enjoyed it. I have wanted to make this video literally since before I even started my channel. It was originally going to be my first video, and then I got caught up in other stuff, and I wanted to spend more time researching it. Anyway, let me know in the comments how you have been spending your Pride Month, or how you plan to spend Pride Month. And also, don't forget to check out all the amazing authors I used for my research in the description. And then also, go down to the description to order a copy of my graphic novel about Claude Cahun, and then also use the links to find out more about how you can support and donate to Palestinians. So, until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and save a circle of violets for your beloved.